and welcome to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. Is it merely a squabble over a bunch of rocks in the Pacific, or Beijing's projection of power? The growing competition for sovereign control of a number of Pacific islands highlights the growing instability among important trading partners. What is driving this competition? Nationalism at home, or all-important geopolitical interests? To crosstalk this island dispute, I'm joined by Bruce Klingner in Washington. He's a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Also in Washington, we have Brian Becker. He is the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition. And in Ithaca, we cross to Mark Selden. He is a senior research associate in the East Asia program at Cornell University. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump anytime you want. Mark, how would you characterize what's going on between China and its neighbors in all of these disputes, particularly the one that's going on in the Pacific right now?
Well, I'd like to begin by locating it within a series of territorial disputes in the Asia-Pacific seas. This means we're not just talking about a China-Japan dispute, we're also talking about a Japan-Korea dispute over Dokdo Takeshima. We're talking about Japan ongoing disputes with Russia over the northern islands, as the Japanese call them. We're talking about disputes in the South China Seas between China, Vietnam, Philippines, and others. So something is going on very large and significant around territorial issues in the Asia-Pacific, and I'm going to come back to talk about why this is and why now. But secondly, we're talking about the rise of nationalism as a response to these issues. Nationalism that's driven by competing territorial claims, yes, but is also driven by historical memory issues centering on war and colonialism. This is why the issues are so fraught in both China and Korea.
Mark, if I could jump in here, if I go to Brian, it sounds like China has a lot of problems with its neighbors. If we just, considering what Mark just said, go ahead.
Well, yes, China has problems with its neighbors. It also has problems with the United States, which just went to Japan to announce the creation of a second missile defense shield that China interprets to be a threat to China, as it should interpret it. I think what we see here in this case with these islands is that the Japanese government, the federal government, under pressure from right-wing nationalists in Tokyo and elsewhere, has engaged in a provocation, buying the islands from Japanese businessmen who don't own them, and then trying to create a fait accompli for the Chinese. And obviously the Chinese people, with strong anti-colonial sentiments, recognizing that these islands were seized at the same time as Taiwan was seized in 1895, are up in arms in protests around the country. But I think it's from below, it's from the masses of people, but obviously it's also from the Chinese government and the Chinese media.
Okay. Bruce, is China getting a raw deal in all of this because it's all against China?
Well, it's not all against China. It's certainly there's the dispute between South Korea and Japan and Russia. So there are a number of issues. And yeah, the reasons for it really are all of the above. There's the long-standing territorial disputes. It's flavored with historic animosities given Japanese actions in the last century. There's also rising nationalism, particularly in China. And we're also seeing it in Japan and Korea. And then also what makes this different from the similar incidents in 2005, 2006 is that Beijing's much more willing to assert itself in the past. And that's what led Secretary Panetta to express concern that particularly the issue between Japan and China could get out of hand, even inadvertent clashes, which always have the danger of escalating further.
Mark, is the United States reluctantly being dragged into this, or is it happy that it has proxies to contain China?
Yeah. Well, what's the sequence of events that we're looking at here? We're looking at a multiple series of events. One is the Obama administration signaling a greater United States role, a greater American tilt toward the Asia-Pacific. But we're also looking at rising nationalism all across the region. Now, I'm not of the view that we should lay this at China's footsteps. It seems to me that the latest series of incidents basically begins with the governor of Tokyo, Ishihara's, making a bid for the islands and then forcing the Japanese government to follow suit They've now bought the islands for $26 million. This is throwing a flame in the direction of China, and it's not surprising that exactly at the season when Chinese respond to the anniversary of the Manchurian incident, when Japan created Manchukuo, that Chinese nationalism is aflame again. So I think we have a series of interactive events in which the United States finds itself a party to a set of issues and is now in the very uncomfortable position as to whether it will support Japan as the Japanese government has pressed it to, or whether it will try to cool the situation in the region. And I hear the United States talking in both of these directions. I'm not sure which way it will go, but the situation is opened up precisely because some of the talk has been to frame this in terms of U.S.-China conflict, which is on the horizon for the presidential election, as we know, on many fronts, and will continue to intensify in the coming months.
Okay, Brian, if I can go back to you, I mean, if the Japanese have these guarantees from the United States, then they can act in a provocative way, buying these islands.
Exactly. I don't think, and I think that this happened right before Panetta went to China. I don't think Japan is acting independently. I think this is part of a script. Of course, Japan has its own internal political situation and its own regional interests. But let's look at the whole big picture. Let's step back. You had President Obama going to Australia, announcing the pivot towards Asia, which means the militarization of U.S. role in Asia. He's just announced the 9th trade lawsuit against China. He did that in Ohio, pandering, of course, to Ohio voters. But that's the 9th lawsuit, not the first. And at the same time, you have the U.S. cementing its military relationship with Japan, which can only be viewed in a threatening way by China, and especially now with the second missile defense shield. So I think the United States is, on one hand, pretending to be sort of diplomatically in the middle and hoping both sides speak softly and don't carry big sticks. But behind the scenes, I think the United States is really working with Japan to create more tension on and more pressure on China, especially as China is going through its leadership transition.
Okay, Bruce, I saw you shaking your head, so go right ahead.
Yeah, I think we can look at it both tactically and strategically. At the tactical level, all these various disputes, Washington, both publicly and privately, is trying to maintain a strictly neutral position on sovereignty issues. We don't have a dog in the fight. Particularly in the dispute between South Korea and Japan.
You think that's really true? We don't have a dog in the fight? Then what's the pivot?
The last 6 months have shown that the United States,
what's the pivot?
The United States is creating bilateral relations with Vietnam, Philippines. All of that is directed against the People's Republic of China.
That is why I distinguish between tactical and strategic. On the purely sovereignty issue over which country has sovereignty or jurisdiction over an island, the American government has clearly said we take no position, we are neutral in each of those disputes. The aspect that the U.S. also indicates, though, is we want every dispute to be resolved peaceably. On the strategic level, one of the reasons behind the Asia pivot, as the Obama administration calls it, has been a growing concern not only by the United States, but by Asian nations, Japan, South Korea, Australia, throughout Southeast Asia, about growing Beijing's assertiveness, some would say aggressiveness, willing to use intimidation against smaller nations, particularly in Southeast Asia. And that goes back to the 2010 Senkaku incident, all that. So the U.S. is increasingly concerned about what Chinese intentions or actions might be, and that was one of the reasons behind the interest in reprioritization toward Asia.
Go ahead, Brian.
How could one possibly sit here and with a straight face say that the United States is concerned about the feelings of nations in Southeast Asia, for instance, and that's why it's coming to their aid, because they feel China is bullying them? The United States killed 2 million Vietnamese and a lot of Cambodians and a lot of Laotians. This is part of a geostrategic move by the United States to contain China, which it sees emerging as a major economic and military competition. When President Obama came into office, he tried to tone down the language of George W. Bush, the language of competition, but he's right back in it, almost with the identical position of Bush at this point in the administration.
Okay, Mark, you wanted to jump in there? Go ahead.
Yes, I do. I think that there's one very specific issue that needs clarifying here, and that is the response of the United States to the China-Japan conflict. Immediately when it broke, Japan's foreign minister at that time, Maehara, raced to Washington and met with Hillary Clinton the next day and asked for support. And specifically, he asked that the United States would make a statement indicating that the United States viewed China's claims on Diaoyutai Senkakus as a violation, that the United States would treat this under the AMPO Treaty, under the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and would protect Japan under it. So I don't think it can be said the United States has maintained neutrality on this. On the other hand, it's also the case, as Bruce has suggested, that a number of statements did come out of the Pentagon, out of the State Department, saying the United States doesn't have an official position on the islands themselves. But if we go back historically, if we go back to the disposition of these islands and other territories after World War II, we have to pay attention to the crucial role that the United States played in making all of the territories that we now are looking at. This was the San Francisco Treaty of 1951. China was excluded from it. And in that treaty, what the United States did was to create, all across the Asia-Pacific, a series of decisions about ownership without, at any point, spelling out the latitude, longitude, specifics of where the boundaries ended, who owned them,
Mark, that's a very interesting point. We're going to go to a short break. We'll return to history here. After a short break, we'll continue our discussion on the island dispute. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're talking about the China-Japan island dispute. Okay, Bruce, I'd like to go back to you. Has China been dealt a raw deal? I mean, if we, in light of what Mark said before we went to the break, I mean, after the Second World War, all these things were decided without China participating.
Well, I think you can argue that China, was dealt a raw deal, but at the time it was not a member of the UN, et cetera. But I think if you look at the present time, the concern that the U.S. has, and as I said before, the nations of Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia have, certainly called Washington expressing their concern, calling for a larger U.S. presence, a larger U.S. role, because of China's actions recently. And they are concerned that China will continue to try to intimidate them. So the U.S. obviously is bound by treaty to defend certain nations, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, et cetera. So on the one hand, the U.S. is trying to maintain a neutral position on the sovereignty of the who owns which rock in the ocean issue, but we also obviously have different relationships with the nations in the area. We're certainly bound by treaty to some of them, and if push comes to shove, then we are allies, and which certainly we are not with China. But we're also trying to maintain all these little sovereignty issues from escalating to something
Bruce,
far greater.
But let me put a
Mark, go ahead, jump in. Mark,
the question really is whether a forward United States position, a forward United States military position on this and other conflicts in the region is the best way to move from the period we're now in of mutual shouting, of nationalism, upsurge, of territorial conflicts, or whether a more fruitful approach is one in which the nations involved in these territorial disputes, and that extends from China and Japan and Korea to ASEAN, find ways to sit down out of the glare of the demonstrators and out of the glare of the media and work out solutions.
Brian, jump in. Go ahead, Brian. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think of course the People's Republic of China and I think the other nations in the region do want a negotiated settlement. They don't want a rise of military tensions. That's not what they really want, and that's certainly not what the People's Republic of China's foreign policy has been signaling. I think, though, that we have to step back and look again to the Obama administration and see the U.S. role here and see it clearly. When the U.S. said it was pivoting towards Asia, what they really meant is that they were re-pivoting towards Asia, because that was the pivot, that was the focus of U.S. foreign policy for a long time. In 1901, the United States invaded the Philippines as part of the opening to Asia. In most of World War II, the war was fought in Asia for the United States. Then there was the Korean War, then the Vietnam War, war after war after war, where the focus, the pivot of U.S. foreign policy was towards Asia. Then it was the Middle East for the last 2 decades, and now the U.S. is reorienting its military hardware towards Asia. That's a dangerous thing given the historical precedent of what the pivot or focus on Asia has meant. And China is well aware of this. They're threatened by Japan because of Japan's historic role as the colonizer and butcher of China, but they're also threatened now by a U.S.-Japanese military alliance, which in spite of its desire, China's desire for a diplomatic solution, a diplomatic resolution, a peaceful road, is being threatened by this cementing relationship. And given the history, we can see that they have good reason to feel threatened.
Okay, Bruce, you know, everyone's in the media talking about the rise of nationalism in China. Just a second, let me ask this. The rise of nationalism in China. But if a country feels encircled, well, then you get nationalism, don't you? I mean, it's kind of logical.
Well, when we talk about this re-cementing of the U.S.-Japanese alliance, or the resurgent U.S.-Japanese alliance, it's been in place for decades. And certainly, Japan was militaristic in the early half of the last century, but since then they've been clearly pacifist in their nature. The U.S. has actually been trying to get Japan to do more for its own self-defense, as well as to address issues of common international concern overseas. The U.S. military forces are in South Korea in response to the North Korean invasion in 1950. They're in Japan both for the defense of Japan and as part of the treaty to maintain peace and stability in Asia. And many of the bases in Japan are also directed for a Korean contingency. The Asia pivot of the Obama administration really isn't a pivot. Or not even a rebalancing, as the Obama administration claims, because there's no change in forces. Well, what we have is a drawing down in Iraq.
You can see that they're bringing the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force is growing exponentially over the next years in terms of the Asia-Pacific region.
Incorrect.
And the U.S.
If you look at the Marine redeployment to Darwin, it's part of the unit deployment program, which is in place before 9/11.
Look at the next 10 years, the next 20 years, the next 10 or 20 years. This is where it's going in terms of the organization of U.S. military forces.
You have a drawdown in U.S. forces overall.
Okay.
You have, given the $500 billion in cuts, and an additional $500 billion under sequestration.
Maybe a drawdown in the number of, the drawdown in number of troops, but the Pentagon is still and will be, as we will see, a dominant force in the political calculations as well as the military calculations of U.S. foreign policy.
You'll
There's
see
going to be an
expansion,
not a contraction of U.S. military forces.
And it will continue to shrink.
Okay, Mark, I want to change gears here. I'd like to go back to Mark. I'd like to go back to Mark. I mean, these are important trading partners at the same time. I mean, this is what's really odd about it, because, you know, I was at the APEC summit in Vladivostok, you know, and a lot of talk about trade, and now we have these islands here. How do they square the circle? Mark?
Yeah. Well, obviously these are in direct conflict with each other. Japan has just put out $25 million to buy a series of rocks, and in the process jeopardizing the multi-billion-dollar trade relationship, Japan's largest trade relationship with China. And the question is whether sound voices on both sides can recognize the higher stakes of those issues. But I want to put the island issues we've been talking about in a wider economic framework as well. Then, you know, much of our heated discussion has been about the U.S. military, but I think the economic stakes are interesting to look at as well. What we're looking at is a changing regime in dividing up the oceans on a world scale. And I think if we try to understand both the behavior of China and Japan, a good place to start to understand that is to think about the division of the seas since 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas, and to look at who were the winners and who were the losers. Well, the big winners, you might be surprised to know, or perhaps not, were the great colonial powers, Britain, France, the United States, Japan. The major loser in the division of the seas has been China. So the background to the disputes of the islands comes in a series of steps in which China has experienced large losses. What does this specifically mean? It means that each island comes, each rock that is declared an island comes with 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zones. And what China is experiencing is a tremendous loss of access to the seas. And Japan and the United States have been among the major beneficiaries of this new law, although interestingly the United States is the only power that has not ratified this convention, even while it takes advantage of it.
Isn't that fair for the Chinese to react to that way? In history,
well, it depends on how you go about trying to resolve it. I mean, right now in the Senkaku issue, it's Japan is not the one making military threats. It's China.
Japan created
the US
the provocation,
and others in the region are
Japan created the provocation. Why would Japan do that?
Right, because of the Senkaku's incident in 2010
don't we need to discuss the question of military
Asia
threat not as one of Japan versus China, but rather of Japan and the United States versus China in a situation of this kind?
It's not Washington or Tokyo that's making the military threats. It's senior members of the Chinese leadership.
It's hedging them in favor of Japan at this time.
Brian, you want to jump in there?
The U.S. is a treaty ally with Japan. I think it's quite
clear that Japan and the United States are longtime military allies, that they have a joint economic project. Japan is something of a junior partner to the United States in the region and globally, and it has been such since 1945. I think that what's happening is that China is being denied access to the sea. It is being denied systematically and through new provocations, this one being the latest, access to resources that China considers to be necessary for its development. I believe that if the United States were not a major factor in the calculations going on in the Middle East, the countries of the region would actually find a negotiated settlement. I think the United States doesn't have anything to lose by doing this. It creates provocations and then says to the others, well, you should speak nicely to each other, be mediating, find a peaceful solution. But in the bottom line of the thing is that the United States is intensifying through its relationship with Japan more and more and more pressure on China in this region of the world.
Okay, Bruce, I'm going to give you the last word. 15 seconds. Go ahead.
I think that's ridiculous. The U.S. is trying to mediate a situation here, to calm a situation. Clearly, we didn't instigate the Senkaku's issue here, nor are we instigating
All right, gentlemen, we'll see where it goes. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington and in Ithaca. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, House Talk rules.